Hello and welcome to Security Analysis. The focus this week is on the Sino-Indian relationship, India-China relations. And we thought it would be appropriate to review this in a temporal manner, which is to take stock of this troubled, uneasy bilateral in the middle of 2021. Now, there are a number of reasons why mid-2021 has a certain significance or salience. The first, of course, is related to Galwan, which is that we are roughly a year plus after Galwan. The second is that China is preparing for the centenary of its Communist Party, the CCP, on July 1st. Now, that is a very big ticket item for the party and for President Xi Jinping in particular. Along with that, there have been other developments. For instance, a report which seemed to suggest that China's high-speed railway network from Lhasa to the extreme east to a point called Ningchi, which is the last railhead, would be completed again by the end of June in time for the anniversary of the CCP. What does that mean? And related to this, at a larger regional and global context, in the middle of this year, we've had some significant geopolitical developments by way of the summit meeting between US President Joe Biden and his Russian counterpart, Mr. Putin. We also seem to have what could be called as a reset between US-NATO after the Trump years. Now, all of these in different ways have implications for the bilateral, the Sino-Indian relationship. So we thought we would explore many of these facets. And towards this end, I'm delighted to introduce and welcome a Blue Ribbon panel. We have with us Lieutenant General Rakesh Sharma. Till recently, he was the Adjutant General of the Indian Army, a Gorkha General, and in parentheses, without a smile, let me say a thinking Gorkha General. Rakesh, who also is a PhD, and I'm very happy to say that he was my colleague at the IDSA, and we've had many useful discussions over the years. And for purposes of our discussion today, let me also add that he was the Corps Commander of the 14 Corps in Ladakh. And in the period 2013-14, if I remember right, it was a very relevant operational time. We'll touch upon that in the course of our discussion. But welcome, Rakesh.
Thank you.
Delighted to have you on board. Let me also introduce and welcome Sushant Singh. Now, Sushant is also a friend of many years. He's a sapper from the Indian Army, left early and enriched Indian journalism, had a long stint and was the deputy editor of the Indian Express. And currently he is now on the think tank circuit. And very soon he'll be heading off to Yale to teach over there. But he's also affiliated with the CPR and a couple of other think tanks in Delhi. Welcome, Sushant.
Thank you so much, sir.
And our last member on the panel, who's academically great water table, is Dr. Zorawar Daulat Singh. Zorawar, some of you may be aware, has made a very significant contribution to the slim literature on China in India. And he's just released his fourth book, if I remember right. Zorawar, would that be right? The fourth book on China-India relations. And all of them, I have seen two of them in some length, have been very insightful and have brought a lot of perspective to the China-India relationship. So I'm delighted, Zorawar, that you could also join. So what I will do, if it's okay, is that I will start with you, Sushant. There's been a lot of, I would say, discussion in the public domain, in some quarters of the media, about where are we 1 year after Galwan along the line of actual control. You had a very thoughtful piece that I remember reading in the Hindu a few days ago, where you spoke about the current status. So if you could just walk us through this, what is the current status on the LAC and anything else that you feel would be relevant to our viewers? All yours, Sushant.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Thanks for having me on your show. Firstly, sir, as most of us are aware, the crisis began last May, and it has been 13 months since. And the crisis was at multiple points in Ladakh, where the PLA soldiers had come on to what was territory in Indian control and denying Indian control of the territory. The stated aim of India, stated by various government officials, ministers, military commanders, has been the restoration of status quo ante as of April 2020 or before the crisis began. 13 months down the line, the status quo ante has not been restored at any point whatsoever. And when I refer to these points, I'm talking about these 7 or 8 points, starting from north, the Depsang Plains, Galwan, Gogra, Hot Spring, north bank of Pangong, south bank of Pangong or the Kailash ranges, and and Demchok. Out of these areas, the only disengagement which we saw was in on the north bank of Pangong and on the Kailash range. That disengagement took place in February. And that disengagement was not towards a restoration of the status quo ante. It was a creation of a new status quo, which was, to be absolutely clear, not unfavorable to India. It was a new status quo, but both sides had moved back. But even in these two areas of Pangong Lake North Bank, as well as the Kailash ranges, there has been no de-escalation. The forces have not de-inducted out of the theater in that sense. Whereas in all these other areas, the two forces still remain face to face. So in some sense, it's an uneasy calm that continues to exist, which has meant that a large number of Indian troops, by army chief's own count, around 50 to 60,000 Indian troops continue to remain deployed in Ladakh. And there are two PLA divisions which are also deployed across the LAC in Ladakh. Moreover, this has also led India to redeploy its troops both in the eastern sector and in the middle sector, where certain forces have been reoriented towards the China border. Certain forces have been pushed up to remain more alert. So, in certain sense, the Indian Army's posture over the last 1 year towards China has been become twofold. The China has become the number one priority, as the CDS General Rawat said in an interview last week, a much bigger priority than Pakistan. And secondly, accordingly, Indian armed forces have reoriented their troops, including one strike corps from the Pakistan border towards the China border. While all this has happened, internal rebalancing has happened. A lot of external rebalancing has also taken place. So we have seen this deep engagement with Quad, the Quad summit, the visit of the Indian foreign minister to Washington D.C., where he discussed the China border issue with the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and so on and so forth. The American military officials have gone on record in various hearings and said that they provided intelligence and logistic support to India. So, in some sense, there has been a twofold response to this from India. One is the internal rebalancing, which has taken place in terms of military orientation, and second is this external rebalancing in terms of partnerships, much stronger counter to the Chinese view. But all this is happening in an environment of deep turmoil for India when it is facing the pandemic. The gap between China and the US is reducing, while the gap between India and China is increasing, and this places India at a very precarious and very dicey situation.
I'll come back to you, Sushant. I think there's some very important strands over here related both to geopolitics, diplomacy, and can India sustain the reorientation? But in a moment, let me turn to General Rakesh Sharma. Rakesh, if you could just take this forward. Now, you were the corps commander in that period, and Depsang happened on your watch. Now, after what Sushant has said, how would you sort of, again, assess where we are? Particularly, I want you to perhaps spend a couple of moments, if you can, on this high-speed rail. There are a lot of reports, and people say perhaps India is not, as aware as it ought to be of the implications of the high-speed rail. I can't imagine that the Indian Army is not aware, but perhaps you could educate the Indian public. Rakesh?
Thank you, sir. First is, sir, that I think last 1 year has been a year of clarity for us. We have been soft paddling, and we had an ambiguous policy over a very long time, 30 odd years, when we were all planning, working towards this agreement signed and the CBMs and the protocols that were sorted out, and everything was being kind of soft paddled, except, when George Fernandez mentioned that he's the enemy number one. But till last year, May, we had three major incidents in which there were some kind of longer standoffs in 2013, 14, and 17. But 2020 was a game changer, and the game changer in manner that he came in multiple points together, and only in Excitation. And Demchok is not of a similar, issue as compared to what happened in Excitation from Depsang down to, say, Pagong, so north and south. And this means it was with the Xinjiang military division. So multiple points, he did not withdraw back as per protocols. Multiple points, he brought divisions forward and placed them there, which was not done earlier. So there was many firsts that happened in 2020. And one of the first was Galwan, as you have rightly referred to. Now, what's happened in the course of last year is also interesting, sir. If we follow 59 and 60, we wanted 20 kilometers of buffer between the forces. This time, there is a kind of buffer being created. When it happened in Galwan, sir, there was a kind of a buffer of about 4 kilometers created at Galwan. 2 kilometers you go that side of PP14, 2 kilometers we came this side, a 4-kilometer buffer. Finally, when we signed this disengagement in this year, 10th talks, we again created a buffer of 8 kilometers between finger 4 and finger 8. And if we go to Depsang, there is a problem in the manner that he actually wants to come down to Butse post and we want to go up to the plateau. A buffer has been created at a place called Bottleneck. Another 2, 3, 4 kilometers. The Chinese forces are sitting 2 kilometers other side of that Bottleneck, and we are 2 kilometers on side. At Gogra, hot spring is not much of an issue, but Gogra there is also, but it's a narrower buffer. So what the Chinese wanted at 20 kilometers, it hasn't happened. What has happened is that there is no now possibility of a clash happening between forces. There is no patrolling being carried out. So the excitation in all these 3-4 areas where there is possibility of a clash has been avoided by creating a buffer. That's a game changer for how to manage the LAC. First point I wanted to raise. Talking about these infrastructures. Now, very nicely, issue is that he has created 6 highways coming into Tibet. 6 super highways coming into Tibet. I come to railway separately. There was only one road that was connecting Xinjiang to Tibet. Now there's a parallel road which has come up and called G216, which is a parallel road connected to G2. That's one. And he's got 3 more roads, one coming from Yunnan, one coming from Sichuan, and of course that Beijing highway which comes down south. So there are 6 major highways entering into Tibet. And he's planned 5 major railways coming into Tibet, of which one we always know, 2006 onwards, there is that QTR. But this one that we are referring to is the only electrified railway. So it would have that speed. This is the only first electrified railway. And it actually he wants to connect Sichuan, and he also wants to connect Yunnan. It goes across from Nyangchi, Lhasa to Nyangchi, and then splits into 2 parts ahead. And one part going towards Sichuan, Chengdu, one going towards Kunming. That portion, those portions are under still construction. He had to make 47 tunnels, which he did in this course of this one. And he comes within 40 kilometers of the border. He's not crossed, the railway doesn't cross the Yarlung Sangpo, but the railway crosses Yarlung Sangpo at Shigatse. The Lhasa Shigatse train, which is going ahead to Kathmandu, is already in an advanced stage, and he will plan to connect to Kathmandu sometime. So infrastructure-wise, sir, there is a very major change happening on Tibet, sir.
Okay, Rakesh, I'm asking you to hold that thought. I'll come back to you about the implications as far as India in the event that we have to have greater presence along the LAC. But let me turn to Dr. Zorawar Daulat Singh. Zorawar, you heard our 2 experts talking about the current status. Now, if you were to look at this through a geopolitical filter, which is your area of interest and expertise, and whatever has been happening amongst the other 2 major powers who are relevant to India and China, which is the United States and Russia, how would you frame this particular point in mid-2021 as far as India is concerned?
Thank you. Well, firstly, thank you for having this panel. Comrade Bhaskar, I think if it's quite interesting. The last year, seeing this sort of stalemate on the India-China front. The situation is more or less sort of frozen, but there's a lot of activity and changes are happening at the international level. And I think when you juxtapose the two, you're seeing the major powers and many major economies and countries trying to sort of reorient and adapt to both the post-COVID sort of world order that's coming to being, and also sort of a multipolar setting that's coming into play. And I think nothing sort of demonstrates this more than the US outreach to Russia. I mean, the Biden administration is the one that initiated this summit that you referred to with the Russian president just a few days ago on June 15th. So I think that's quite a remarkable and a significant development, both for India and for global stability, because after all, these are two military superpowers. They account for 95% of global nuclear weaponry. So an unstable US-Russia relationship has always been dangerous from a planetary security perspective, like it was even a half a century ago. So the fact that the United States has sought to stabilize the relationship with Russia has, of course, implications both for the way United States will now possibly deal with China. I think there's this belief that for the past decade that the United States has been kind of misplacing its priorities in the way it's dealing with these rising powers, and China has sort of not been given the level of strategic attention that it ought to have been given. So I think now this is that little bit of an internal course correction that's happening. I don't believe the American policymakers or the Russians are really going to engage in some sort of a triangular diplomacy like it happened in the 1970s. You know, the Russia is not going to sort of join the Western camp. There are too many other accumulated problems. This is more about just stabilizing the European front, the Middle East, areas where, to be frank, the main challenge to American power comes from Russia's role in those theaters. China is a very minimal player so far there, other than economic engagement. So if you have a stable sort of front in Western Eurasia, Afghanistan, Iran, you are able to, the United States is thinking that it could have a more focused engagement and interaction with the Chinese. I think let's also not forget that just recently the United States, the Biden administration, just in the last day, has also expressed some sort of a signal that is going to engage in a similar high-level summit with the Chinese leadership as well. So that should actually put aside any kind of this images that we have that there's going to be a whole lot of balance of power diplomacy being played. This is about, and this is a welcome development. The United States is accepting the world has changed. It no longer is or has that level of primacy and preponderance, and it's adapting to what is a more plural balance of power system that's coming into place. For India, this is, of course, in some sense, it partly forces of history playing out. We don't control it, but do we now adapt to it, and do we leverage it in a way that advances our interests and also stabilizes India-China relations? I think there is a possibility, despite the stalemate and a heightened state of competition of the last decade in India-China relations. Ladakh is, by the way, not a one-off crisis, right? It's a manifestation of an accumulation of problems that have been building up, and it sort of reached this crescendo last year. I think now there's a time for a course correction, or at least some sort of a reset in Indian policy. What that shape it takes, I think that's still in flux. But the global setting suggests that at some stage, India will have to come to some sort of a new modus vivendi with China, even if it's a temporary one, lasts a few years, a half a decade, merely for its own self-interest. I think what I found really interesting was from the ideologues in the United States, the fact that they're using terms like self-interest, pragmatism, looking after, and rather than ideology or the old crusade that we faced in the early 2000s. I think that's something we can emulate. You can have competition and strategic engagement at the same time, and I think that's where we should be looking towards.
Thanks, Gaurav. I think again that's some very useful and rich content there. I hope I can come back to you to develop two of these points. But there's one aspect that General Sharma spoke about, the year of clarity. And you have spoken about this as an opportunity for India to, I think, revisit and go back to the drawing board. I am reminded saying that when it comes to China, I'm sure Indian policy makers and those who are in the driver's seat at different points in time are aware somewhere deep within that this is a relationship where India, I think, should remember Gurudev Tagore. It's ekla chalo, that at the end of the day, we'll be on our own because of a number of complex factors. And that is something we cannot, I think, be less than cognizant of. But let me turn to you, Sushant, 2 points. One is I want to again request you to look at this whole Chinese capability and the build-up. One, if you could extend the formulation of the point made by General Sharma about the networks, both road and rail. And the second is some references to increased air power. The fact that they have invested also in air power and that perhaps we are not as aware in the public domain. Sushant?
Sir, so a couple of things on this infrastructure creation. One is, as General Sharma brought out, there's been extensive road network that has been created by China on our western borders, in that sense, in Ladakh. They have virtually on our eastern borders, they have western borders in Ladakh. They virtually in Aksai Chin, there are the road infrastructure is such that they have 4 or 5 communication lines coming in, whereas we have created just one single line. A lot of this conflict is rather not about this major infrastructure, but about a small infrastructure which goes into perceived areas of each other's control, as we saw at Galwan and other places. Even minor constructions can lead to issues. Satellite imagery very clearly shows that the PLA Air Force has upgraded its infrastructure, both military use as well as dual use infrastructure in Ladakh in a major way. Similar infrastructure upgradation has taken place in the Arunachal Pradesh sector, and we saw reports even last year that infrastructure was being created opposite Uttarakhand as well. Then there is the other issue of these Chinese border villages, which have been created all across the border, and some of them in Bhutan, many of them in what is believed to be Indian territory, which come out of an old Chinese plan to actually assert their flag and to ensure that they can show their presence in these areas and eventually say that these are settled areas which are being controlled by them. So in total, these 3 things: the road infrastructure, the air infrastructure, the rail infrastructure, and the creation of these villages creates a whole network of pressure points for India, besides giving the Chinese military, the PLA, an advantage in terms of mobilization, in terms of support, in terms of operational deployments, which India would find tough to manage unless India can devote those kind of resources, which Indian economy at this point in time does not permit. But let me make one additional point here, sir. More important during the last 1 year is that before this, the PLA or the Chinese government or the Chinese establishment used to send all the modern military equipment towards the Taiwan sector. It was never coming to Xinjiang province. But now what we are seeing is more and more modern military equipment is coming to Xinjiang province, is coming to Xinjiang military district, which is being broadcast loudly on the PLA daily. That is one significant shift. And the second shift, which was pointed out to me by Professor Taylor Freville of MIT, was that the fact that the PLA, there is a inter-service rivalry within the PLA, because the only place where the PLA ground forces can show their worth is against India and not against Taiwan. Taiwan is primarily an air and a maritime operation, and whatever else is happening in East China Sea and South China Sea is also a maritime domain. The land forces, and they are the bulk of the PLA. If they have to assert themselves, they have to show their worth in Ladakh. That is something also which we'll have to register at some point in time and understand.
I think, thanks, Sushant. That's a very important point. I don't think many of us have seen the inter-service dynamic within the PLA. But General Sharma, can I request you to look at 2 issues? One is, from everything that you gentlemen have said, in the event that the Indian Army is going to now be along the LAC for a longer period, we have the Khanduri report, General Khanduri's report that goes back to Modi's first term, Modi 1.0. Now there, I think he had highlighted the challenges for the Indian military and the army in particular about inventory and the challenges there. The country is now going through the COVID crisis, which has its own fiscal implications for spending in certain sectors. So in the light of that, how do you see the challenge for the Indian military? And why I'm using the word military and not just the army is that if you want to invest, say, in the maritime domain, If you want to invest, say, in air power or in space, new areas, how is this resource crunch going to be addressed while you maintain the line along the line? Rakesh?
Yes, sir. Now, if we follow the defense budget over the course of last 6, 7 years and even longer, it has not varied much, sir. It has become kind of stagnated with where we are. If we take that the challenger has changed, our focus has rebalanced from the western border across to the Chinese border, then there is a different thought process required here. And the warfare has changed. Now the Chinese will understand that even in without weaponry in Galwan, if we could cause so much of damage to them, which of course they're not announcing, they never announce their casualties. But the fact of the matter is that we could do that, and we had the capacity to have barrel to barrel facing each other on Razangla, sir. For a very long time, when the enemy, when Chinese tanks were climbing up to Razangla, and our tanks were facing, the infantry was facing, they were face to face with each other, and we were able to sustain ourselves. The fact is, sir, that the border wars, and I would say without apprehensions, we will be able to take on a large amount of measure. We have problems in ISR equipment. We don't have the eyes and ears of the quality and the kind that we require, but we have the capacity to take on an adversity on the borders. But that's not the only warfare of the future. No, he has the capacities to overwhelm us by missiles, by rockets, by using electromagnetic spectrums, which is a very major kind of warfare which we have not so much invested in. Or the cyber, say what happened in Bombay, in Mumbai in October last year, when he said they claimed to have switched off, or he said that the the drone was downed by him because of cyber warfare. All those things and all those domains, I think there is an effort required for us to get on with it, because we have now been left out. I am not saying that the Quad is not there and the Americans are not around and there is blessing around of people. But finally, sir, you said Ekla Chalo. Americans have got a $550 billion trade with them. Every Apple phone is produced in China and nowhere else. The fact is, sir, they will finally start thinking about the bottom lines. We have to be worried about all those huge logistic bases that is made right very close to our borders. And Sushant said, sir, these villages, I hope he's not going to 2015, 2005 treaty saying that the villages, the settled areas will not be discussed. So he's changing the demographic pattern by going across to 2005 treaty. We have to now start thinking about a quality of warfare, whether it's in the maritime domain or the air warfare or the ground thing, to start thinking that if it is beyond the borders, how will we handle it? We require to do some work on it.
That's good, Rakesh. I think, we need another discussion just for our viewers. Let me remind everyone here in the public domain, I'm sure our experts and the security officials know all of this. But at the moment, China has made a very significant stride in space over the last few days. And that has its own implications. But again, this is a subject for another discussion. Dr. Zorawar, I want to pick up one sort of observation made by Rakesh, which is the trade issue. That if we talk about the future of India-China relations, now there is a lot of talk, and some of our experts have spoken about, instead of China less, which is not an option, can we talk about less of China for India in the trade investment? Is that a viable proposition? My sharp question to you as the domain expert, and you're such an expert, Zorawar, you'll answer in less than 280 characters. I've seen you do this in the past. The question is, if India wants to be a $5 trillion economy, how do you deal with the Chinese entity as far as this domain is concerned? Dr. Zorawar.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's an important question. I think that's being debated not just in the last year, for the last few years. What is this level of interdependence and engagement that India needs to have, both to allow its own domestic modernization to occur and at the same time benefit from what's happening elsewhere? I think the decision that was taken last year, I personally believe, of trying to sort of in a knee-jerk fashion attempt to roll back the level of engagement, economic engagement with China, actually hasn't borne out. The latest trade statistics itself suggest that in the year of the most extreme military crisis with China, you've got trade still growing. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the Indian economy, the private sector, for various reasons, is entangled with the global economy, and the global economy, because of China's size, is always going to be a player regardless of what you do with the Chinese bilaterally. So if you even deal with Japan or Taiwan or the United States or Germany, there's always going to be some part of China in those supply chains. So I think, why don't we recognize the reality that the geoeconomic environment is a more complex environment, and the old sort of a century ago kind of where you just had these bilateral links and you could sort of sever one and substitute it with another. You have to accommodate the reality that China has already deepened its footprint, and you're going to have to deal with it. So now I think the question is not so much whether you should have economic engagement or not with the Chinese, but where and to what extent. And I think here the private sector is, whenever you let them do what is in their interest, they're going to stamp with their feet and want more. So you, at the same time, as in the state, like the Chinese state, did not allow globalization a free open hand in China, right? I mean, the whole question of innovation, reverse technology and reverse engineering of technology, absorbing FDI into strategic sectors, there was a conscious strategy that is lacking in India. So we go from having no interaction to having this sort of free for all. I think that neoliberal model needs to also adapt. You need a more strategic form of engagement, and what that entails should actually be part of a comprehensive package of a strategic dialogue with China. So this idea that now we've taken a position in the Indian policymakers in the last year that the border is center and upfront. Yes, it is. But if you're going to want some sort of a reciprocity or get the Chinese interested in dealing with stabilizing the frontier, you're going to have to add a lot more issues to the table. And once you have a package conversation, and that's how the United States and all major powers are dealing with each other. If you put in arms control, put in CBM, put in economic interdependence.
And we have issues like climate change, which are right on top of the list globally. So
there's so many core issues which now need to be brought to the table. And I believe from what you are seeing from the Chinese side, their discourse, they're only going to be interested in India-China relations if they were to see India take on a more broader, holistic approach to the China policy. I think, and they have shown. And also, if I may just spend just 30 seconds, the idea of getting bogged down on the frontiers is also quite an adverse development for India. Let's not forget that. I mean, what the Chinese have shown is that they have actually almost neutralized one front, and their priority still remains in the Western Pacific. And it's still, which is, in fact, for India, gives you in the long run of the next 10, 15 years, actually room and a window to have a stable South Asia. Now, the question is, how do you stabilize this particular crisis and don't let it just linger on for the next 10 years? Because I don't think the Chinese are interested in the India front as their core priority, right? They've shown you that they can handle this, their backdoor, their periphery, but their priority is going to be with the United States. So
that's correct.
Can you use that to have some sort of a stability, of course, without losing more ground, and broaden this reset?
Thanks, Zorawar. I'm going to request you. I think you've given us the equivalent of very useful concluding thoughts. Let me turn to Sushant and Rakesh for their own concluding thoughts in the following manner, which is that, please, I think, pitch it in this way, that your audience is the Indian parliamentarian, meaning that we hope that when Parliament reconvenes, they would be looking at this issue in their internal deliberations. And the other is, Rakesh, Gen Next for India, the younger demography. So if you had roughly 90 seconds and you wanted to leave some takeaways, can I request you, Sushant, you can go first, and then Rakesh, about how do you want to leave some concluding thoughts, both for the policymaker, the parliamentarian, and for the young Indian, who are all on the same page when it comes to China?
If I'm speaking to parliamentarians, I would rather go in Hindi. And मैं यही कहूँगा कि सर जो चाइना के साथ हमारी जो अभी करंट स्थिति है उसको समझने की ज़रूरत है, और उसके साथ एक लॉन्ग टर्म प्लान की ज़रूरत है, जिसके बेसिस पर आप एक स्ट्रैटेजी बना सकते हैं, एक डॉक्ट्रिन कर सकते हैं, और उस तरह की इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट चाहिए। जब तक कि भारत अंदरूनी तौर पर मजबूत नहीं होगा, वो बाहरी तौर पर भी मजबूत नहीं हो सकता है। वो अंदरूनी मजबूती के लिए जो भी करने की जरूरत हो, सामरिक शक्ति बनाने के लिए, इकोनॉमी को मजबूत करने के लिए, वो करने की बहुत ज्यादा आवश्यकता है।
धन्यवाद। जनरल साहब, सरल तरीके से आप भी कुछ बताइए हिंदी में, अगर हो सके तो।
सर, मैं कहना चाहूंगा सर कि हमको ये बात जरूरी है कि इकोनॉमिक इंटरेक्शन है उसको हटाना नहीं जा सकता है। $77 बिलियन का ट्रेड हमारा लास्ट ईयर रहा, इस 6 महीने में ट्रेड बहुत ज्यादा बढ़ गया है, तो वो इसको सेग्रीगेट नहीं किया जा सकता। पर कहने का तात्पर्य यह है कि हमको अपना डॉक्ट्रिनल इश्यूज पे फिर से सोचना पड़ेगा, बिकॉज चाइना का अगर आज तक उनके पास ब्लास्ट पैन नहीं थे एयरफील्ड्स पे, तो वो वहां पे टेक ऑफ नहीं कर सकते। अभी उन्होंने ब्लास्ट पैन बना दिया है, अब सर्वाइवेबिलिटी बना दिया है, ह्यूज डंप्स आर बीइंग मेड। सो ये बात ये है कि इसको बॉर्डर को बिल्कुल अलग नहीं किया जा सकता, बिकॉज कल को अगर ये फिर होगा तो हमारी पब्लिक पूछेगी यार एक बार आपको झटका लगा था, आपने क्यों तैयारी नहीं की। सो द deterrence by denial is absolutely important. We have to deny to him any opportunity to make further ingress. We can do the geopolitical maneuverings wherever we wish to do so, but we just cannot disallow us to have a deterrence by denials.
थैंक यू। अभी हम अंत में यही कह सकते हैं कि जहां तक भारत चीन का जो द्विपक्षीय रिश्ता है, ये कई सदियों से बार बार यही हम कहते आए हैं कि ये जटिल है, इसके अंदर कई सारे मुद्दे हैं और एक प्रकार से ये बहुत प्राचीन भी है। पर आज के हालात में जिस प्रकार से हमारे जानकारों ने कहा है, सबसे पहली बात यह है कि एक संपूर्ण तरीके से एक हमको स्ट्रैटेजी या एक सामरिक पॉलिसी जो है वो बनाना बहुत ज़रूरी है, और ये जल्दबाजी में नहीं हो सकता है। किसी देश ने अपने नेशनल पॉलिसी जल्दबाजी में नहीं किया है। तो जस्ट एज डॉक्टर जोरावर has said and the others, I think there is perhaps a case for this to be seen as a reality check. Just as America had a reality check with China in the Trump years, hopefully the silver lining of Galwan and what has followed is that we would review our China policy more holistically and I would say more objectively and arrive at some tracks, knowing fully well that in this era of globalization, some options are not as viable in the long term as they may appear to be at this point in time. But this is a complex subject. I want to thank my three guests, General Rakesh Sharma, Mr. Sushant Singh, and Dr. Zorawar Daulat Singh for sharing their thoughts. I'm sorry if I've interrupted you, but I hope that we can get you back at some point because this is a very important subject and there's lots that we need to, again, as I said, have in the public domain. On that note, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for watching Security Analysis. We'll be back again next week.